we haven't seen sight of the bill. We won't see it till, I don't know, probably Tuesday at best, and maybe later. Will we have hours to put in amendments? Will the amendments be couched in a legal mind? We don't have the resources to make sure that they stick, to get them onto the floor. And then will the minister guillotine it before? I mean, as has happened with so many pieces of legislation throughout COVID, we might have got to the first two amendments of maybe 80 or 120, and it's guillotined, and the rest of them are waste. So it's not democratic. It's not a democracy. It's a totalitarian regime.
You're very welcome to today's episode of The State We're In. And it is Friday, the 26th of November, 2021. There's growing alarm at the proposed legislation to consolidate 4 existing pieces of legislation into one new piece of legislation that will give the Minister for Health very extensive powers into the middle of 2022. And in particular, great alarm is being expressed at one section of the bill, which you can see there on your screen, which says, to provide for powers for certain medical officers of health to order, in certain circumstances, detention of persons who are suspected to be potential sources of infection with COVID-19, and to provide for enforcement measures in that regard, and to confer on the Minister for Health the power to designate areas as areas of infection of COVID-19 and to provide for related matters. I'm joined now by Deputy Mattie McGrath, who is the leader of the independent group, who has voiced concerns earlier today about this proposed legislation. Thank you so much, Mattie.
Brian, I'm Kate Minifont, and I'm leader of the Rural Independent Group. To go to the chase, you have outlined what's happening. I just have the briefing notes as whip of the group. I got in yesterday at 3:30, and you obviously shared on the slide, and I saw that and got a massive response, and rightly so. And I did this in an effort to reawaken people or awaken people to, what's happening now. While some of these pieces of legislation were all enacted, most of them rushed, none of them with pre-legislative scrutiny over the last 20 months. At the outset, we were dealing with an unknown situation. But surely one would think 20 months on that we would be able to have our ducks in a row and have, proper legislation. This legislation is kind of a blindfolded because it doesn't specify. It specifies that these individual people, health officials, medical people, doesn't say what category, whether doctors or nurses or whatever, whether they'll use any PCR testing, is just on their say so. The person can be detained. And worse than that, under the original 47 Health Act and the Middle Health Acts going back over decades, persons and medical people and the Gardaí had powers to detain a person if they thought, or persons that were going to do harm to themselves or anybody else. But in that case, you were entitled to legal representation, you were entitled to a second medical opinion. But here, there's nothing prescribed in what I've seen in the notes here, the briefing notes, of any of that, or has it been in the current legislation that they're consolidating into one? So this is the alarming part I see. There's no prescriptive, categories attached to this legislation. That how long are you going to be detained for? There's no end date, and where are you going to be detained? Hospital or other settings. Doesn't specify where the other settings should be. So I believe this would fall in any legal challenge, and I hope to be able to submit amendments to. If we get the bill on time, that we'll be able to submit amendments. But then, of course, the amendments can only be moved and passed, and if they get support from the opposition and the government are minded to take them. Because this is a kind of a liquid sauce. You're handing out carte blanche power to the minister. While he may have it already, and Bill point that out, yes, this is consolidating it into a new act. So you think it will be tidied up, and it would be proper legislation after 20 months. That it would be prescriptive, there would be time periods, there would be appeal mechanisms, and above all, under any basic human rights, calculation in any country in the world, that you would have a right to appeal and a right to to contest whether you're a risk to anybody, yourself, your family, or anybody else, is so vague and so loose and so dangerous. And, it's very scary.
Can you just clarify one thing for me? Is there going to be pre-legislative scrutiny of this bill?
No, I was told at the business committee yesterday morning, which I attend on behalf of my group, that's where this came up. We're laying out the all business for the next week, starting on the 31st, Tuesday. It's a packed agenda. This always happens. It normally is, aside of pandemics, there's always at the end of the year, pre-Christmas, huge amounts of legislation rushed, which is not a good practice. But I was told that when I questioned it, that there was no legal, there was no pre-legislative scrutiny, that the committee had waived pre-legislative scrutiny. Albeit, I found out further questioning, at least there was a vote at committee, and the vote was beaten by the government won the vote by 4-3. So at least there's some 3 people in there that were concerned about this. I don't know their names or what members, senators or TDs, but I do know that the government had presented it, the whip at the party quite glibly. Remember when they got this the night before at 10:30, not this, but the fact that the legislation was coming in on Friday, and albeit he presented that committee had acquiesced to pre-legal scrutiny, which is a practice that's crept in, especially around this legislation, but other legislation too. Pre-legislative scrutiny is vital because it gives members a chance to tease out the very things I said to you at the outset, that there's no prescriptive dates or places or timelines or right of appeal or right of representation, which have to be in every act. And we see them in court cases up and down the country, all over the world, but in Ireland, always been legislation has been quoted and been thrown asunder by good barristers and legal minds. And that's their job. And to pick holes in the legislation, and as often legislation has fallen. So this is just a loose bag. We're dealing with a minister, obviously, that has come into this job, been in opposition before that, asking the same questions I was asking to a limited extent. But now he doesn't know how it's like to be a minister for health without these legal emergency provisions. It's a whole different ballgame. So this is very dangerous. And the man, he can decide how long to detain somebody, where they're detained, or at his whim. That's a very dangerous situation in any democracy, in any republic for that matter. And I hope that enough TDs will see the dangers fraud ordained and the Irish Council of Civil Liberties and the UN and everybody else. Are we all following one agenda here? When you look at what's happening in other continents and countries and Europe, you wonder, are we just all following the same script?
In April 2020, I highlighted the case of a young man in Ballincollig in Dublin who was arrested at 8 o'clock in the morning. He was asleep on the couch in the sitting room of his house. He was arrested by a number of Gardaí, brought before a court on suspicion that he was a danger to public health because people in the house had tested positive for COVID. He was remanded in custody to Cloverhill Prison. He was put into solitary confinement because of public health issues. And then the first hearing of the court, he didn't appear. It was a remote hearing. And actually, then the mainstream media didn't report on what was the outcome of that. And I was extremely, extremely alarmed that the guards could come into somebody's house at 8 o'clock in the morning and arrest them on suspicion of being a threat to public health because somebody in the house, 2 people in the house, had tested positive for COVID. So as you say, alarm bells should be ringing right across the country. This bill, if it is passed by the government, will give powers to arbitrarily arrest people on suspicion, and it's just suspicion of being COVID positive, and brought to a place of detention. And as you say, that hasn't been decided, or it hasn't been mentioned where those places of detention will be. And the other thing that really concerns me is that if this bill goes through, the Minister for Health will continue to have the powers to introduce new regulations without consulting with the Dáil. So there's nothing to stop him from introducing a regulation stating that the person must remain in that place of detention until they're vaccinated.
No right to appeal, or no right to legal or medical, assessment, or indeed no right to technical test, whatever test it is, antigen or PCR or whatever, to prove or disprove. I know of countless families who 2 people in the house may have got COVID and suffered with it and recovered, and others didn't. Husband and wives, brothers and sisters, sleeping in the same rooms. And this is fraught with danger. But I want to know what the civil, as Council of Civil Liberties are doing. But I also want to know, the minister, I railed against this. The Gardaí could go into any house at any time under the instruction of the minister. And this is the case I was aware of at the time, I'd forgotten. I'm going to be asking questions under FAI and parliamentary questions to find out how many times this has been used since 2020 and why the need. Like 2020, we had a new pandemic. I have said before, I walked out of government buildings, staggering with the fear and with what I had consumed that they are being told by the government and indeed by Messrs. Houlihan and others. But as time went on, thankfully, we saw how, it didn't transpire, thankfully, and like they were telling us. And now we, after spending 3.884 billion extra in 2020, we went on the pandemic in the health department. We won't know what they spent in 2020 or 2021, but I'm sure it'll be a lot more extra. Here we are trying to hold on to this piece of the Keynesian legislation that's not fit for any modern democracy, and it trods everybody's civil and rights to their liberty and rights to the protection of their home as their castle. It trods in so many pieces of the Constitution. And what I do see, and I said this yesterday, and others said it as well at the meeting, where does it leave the president, O'Brien and Michael D. Higgins, who came out strongly? It was the first time I ever heard of an intervention like that, and was a very annoyed and met his annoyance knowing that he got so many pieces of legislation handed to him one day, most of it without pre-legislative scrutiny. And here we are literally giving the 2 fingers to O'Brien and that we'll do this again with no pre-legislative scrutiny. I mean, there's something badly wrong here. We have to respect all the institutions of the Oireachtas and indeed of our state, the courts, of all the people that produce the Constitution is meant to protect. But the Oireachtas in separate their powers with across the river with the courts. But when the president is being ignored so flagrantly, and he's pretty forthright comments, and I did say at the time, and I don't want to criticize the president, that what I thought he should have done was send back half of them. Hold them on, lads. I can't look at all these. It's the same for us. We haven't seen sight of the bill. We won't see it till, I don't know, probably Tuesday at best, and maybe later. Will we have hours to put in amendments? Will the amendments be couched in a legal mind? We don't have the resources to make sure that they stick, to get them onto the floor. And then will the minister guillotine it before? I mean, as has happened with so many pieces of legislation throughout COVID, we might have got to the first 2 amendments of maybe 80 or 120, and it's guillotined, and the rest of them are waste. So it's not democratic. It's not a democracy. It's a totalitarian regime. And as I said, when you look across the world and see what's happening, and see the breezes blowing across here, the script seems to be the same, evolving in every jurisdiction.
On that note then, Mattie, we will leave it. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time to explain this to us today.
We'll watch this space, and I certainly and my colleagues will do our best to get this amendment withdrawn, but I don't know how far that's going to go. But the minister needs to have a fact check here, and a health check, and stall their horses here.
So much, Mattie, for that update. And for those of you who have been watching, you can go to the Lawyers for Justice Facebook page, and they have a post on this outlining the measures that you can take to try and stop it. Also, Tracy O'Mahony is a barrister, and she has a YouTube channel, and I would advise you to go to her YouTube channel and watch out for her latest updates on this. It's a very, very serious matter. We need to take action immediately to try and stop this bill from being passed. Thank you so much for watching. And we are a new news platform. And we never ask you for financial contributions, but we do ask you to subscribe to our Facebook page and YouTube channel. And please, please, I implore of you to please share this video to get this message out to the rest of the country. Thank you so much. And until we meet again, Bannock Day Arif Galer.